Right. So we'll be starting off with microorganisms today. That is the chapter 3 of your science book. Now, starting from the very basics, what are microorganisms? Now, the microorganism by itself, the word itself, it says that they are organisms that are very, very small, which means that they're very tiny living organisms. Now, by tiny, I mean that they are such unicellular organisms, and unicellular means single-celled organism. They're such single-celled, unicellular, tiny living organisms that they're impossible to see with the naked eye. So whenever we're talking about microorganisms, they're living organisms that cannot be seen without a microscope. So we always need a microscope to observe or to see our microorganisms. They're always around us. They're around here in our environment, in the atmosphere, on different objects, on different, you can say, they're even present in the food, they're present in things we touch, they're present everywhere around us. But we cannot see them because they're impossible to see with the naked eye, and we need a microscope to observe them. So there are many different types of organisms, the microorganisms, but the two that we're going to be studying under this topic are going to be the bacteria and the microscopic fungi. So let's talk about bacteria first. Now, when we're talking about bacteria are also unicellular organisms. They can be small, they can be large, they've got a large range of sizes. So bacteria are larger than viruses and they're smaller than fungi. So bacteria come between the two categories that are the viruses and fungi. The size of the bacteria comes between these two sizes. They're larger than viruses, but they're smaller than fungi. And when we're talking about bacteria, the three basic types or the three following shapes of the bacteria are going to be as displayed on the screen, which is the spherical shape, the rod shape, and the spiral shape. And the names that are written under these images are the scientific names that we use for these specific bacteria. However, it's all right as long as you know the names that are the spherical, rod shape, and spiral. All right?
All right.
Okay, moving forward with it, what is a bacterial cell? Now, we know what bacteria is. We know they're unicellular organisms. We know they vary in size, but they're so small that we cannot look at them without a microscope. Now, since we cannot see them without a microscope, now this specific bacterial cell that is displayed on the screen is a cell that is under the electronic microscope. So this is very, very small in size, and we can only see it under an electronic microscope. Now, what happens in a bacterial cell is we have a single loop of DNA instead of the nucleus in the cytoplasm. Now, when we're talking about this cytoplasm, that is this jelly-like liquid, semi-liquid material inside your cell, it does not contain a nucleus like an animal cell does. That is the basic property of a cell, that it contains a nucleus. However, a bacterial cell won't contain a nucleus. Instead of a nucleus, it's going to have this strand or single loop of DNA that is included in the cytoplasm. Now, what is DNA? DNA is the short form for ribonucleic acid. Now, you're not supposed to learn that here. We're just going to see what DNA is. DNA is, you can say, it's specific to your genes. So a DNA is going to be a single loop of DNA is going to be present in your bacterial cell. The other thing that is in the bacterial cell is the cell wall or the cell capsule. So the cell wall or the cell capsule is the outer protective layer of your cell. Also, the cell wall also stops the bacterial cell from drying up because it protects it from outside. It does not let the cytoplasm out or any other materials in. So it's kind of a protective layer for your cell, for your bacterial cell. Now, when we're talking about bacterial cells, some bacterial cells might also have flagella. Now, what is flagella? Flagella or flagellum, flagella is the plural for flagellum. Flagellum is this thread-like structure that allows the bacterial cell to move around. So it helps in the movement of your bacterial cell. Another thing that is specific to your bacterial cell is their rapid reproduction. Now, when we're talking about bacterial cells, they reproduce very, very rapidly. So they are reproducing in seconds. They are reproducing into millions and trillions into seconds and minutes. So they have a very rapid reproduction, which means that if they cause any disease inside the body, they're going to be rapidly reproduced and they'll be spread out throughout the body or throughout the organs. Another thing that is specific to the bacterial cell that I've already told you is that it is not seen by a naked eye, so we need an electronic microscope. However, a bacterial colony can be visible to the naked eye. Now, what do I mean by bacterial colony is that millions and trillions of bacteria, when they're together, that is when you can finally see the bacterial colony or the bacteria through the naked eye. So that happens in rare cases when there's a lot of bacteria accumulated. That is when you can see this bacterial colonies by your naked eye. Now, this is also, these colonies are also produced artificially in laboratories for different experiments, for different functions, since many bacteria are also useful to the human body or in the science, so they do produce it artificially. So that is when a bacterial colony is visible to the naked eye. So this is all going to be about the bacteria or the bacterial cell. Do you have any questions up to now?
No.
Moving forward, the next type of microorganism included in the syllabus is going to be the microscopic fungi. Now, when we're talking about fungi, there are lots of fungi. For example, mushrooms or yeast and mold, they're all fungi. So what is fungi? Now, fungi is also a unicellular organism, and it can also be only observed under an electronic microscope. So they're microorganisms. They're obviously going to be they're not going to be visible to the naked eye. When we're talking about the microscopic fungi, the microscopic fungi has a cell membrane, it has a nucleus, it has a cytoplasm, and it has a vacuole. Now, these are the parts of the fungi cell. So the difference between this fungi and bacteria would be that they include a nucleus, which the bacterial cell did not include. It included a strand of DNA. Now, when we're talking about the structure of the fungi cell, it also contains a cell wall like the bacterial cell. However, this cell wall is made up of a different material that is known as chitin. Now, this chitin or chitin, you can call them both. It's just a material that the cell wall is made up of. You don't have to go into the detail of this because that is out of your syllabus. So we'll just stop there. Now, the size of the fungi that we've already told in the bacterial cell also, that a bacterial cell was between the size of a virus and a fungi. So fungi is larger than a bacterial cell. And these fungi can be both useful and non-useful. And the yeast, mold, these mushrooms, toadstools, all of these are going to be examples for your fungi. And this is all that is included in the syllabus related to your fungi. All right.
Okay.
Now, when we're talking about other types of microorganisms other than your fungi and bacteria, there are going to be a lot of microorganisms that are going to come under this parameter. However, the microorganisms mentioned here are going to be these 5 specific microorganisms about which you don't need to get into the detail of these, but you should know the names, which are the amoeba, the paramecium, the diatoms, the euglena, and the chlorella. So these are 5 different microorganisms. They've got different details. They've got different structures that you can see displayed on the screen. They've got different functions. They are useful and non-useful, and they have different specifications specific to each of the different microorganisms. So we're not going to get into the detail for these specific microorganisms. Now, when we're talking about microorganisms and we know that they are living organisms, so they're going to be performing all the they're going to have all this the same life processes that that any other living organism has. So they're going to be respiring as well. So when we're talking about how microorganisms release energy from their food, is going to be through the respiration, which is the complete same process like the one that we have done in the humans. So microorganisms also need energy and nutrients, so they obtain that from food. And to release this energy from food, microorganisms carry out this process called respiration. And in this process, they obviously use food to give out energy and carbon dioxide. Now, when we're talking about releasing energy from food through respiration, there is one important thing that comes under this specific topic. Now, this is going to be the yeast. Now, we know that yeast is a kind of useful thing for the humans. Now, how it useful is, now when we're talking about yeast, it's used in baking, which, it is used in baking. So this baking is done through yeast. Now, what happens in this process is that this yeast is used to produce carbon dioxide gas, which gives the bread or the dough a fluffy rise. Now, what happens is that since it produces carbon dioxide, the starch that we put into the dough, it contains yeast cells. Now, this yeast cells, these microorganisms, they go and they respire, and through this respiration, the carbon dioxide that is produced is trapped in tiny bubbles. And when you heat them in the oven, so when you heat that dough in the oven, it expands and it gives rise to the dough. And when it gives rise to the dough, these tiny bubbles are filled with gas. So the gas bubbles, they expand and they give rise to the dough, and that is when the dough rises. So when you see this specific bread, this is made out of yeast or dough, this specific bread has circles or holes in it. So these are the holes that were filled with gas, or you can say they were the gas bubbles that got heated and got expanded. And these are why the bread or the dough, it got rised up and it got fluffy and it expanded. So this is how yeast is useful for the human use. It is specifically used in our baking and things like that. So this is how our microorganisms release energy from food through respiration. So whenever there's questions related to your yeast and your respiration, they're going to be interrelated questions in which we're going to be asked about your respiration, and you're going to be asked about how yeast uses respiration and how it's useful for the humans, or how is it useful in the process of baking. All right. So the next topic is going to be viruses. Now, in the start, we said that we have microorganisms that include bacteria, that include fungi, and includes other organisms such as the amoeba and the other organisms that we studied before. Now, what are viruses? Now, when we're talking about viruses, we know that different diseases such as the cold and the flu are spread through viruses. We already know this through our previous knowledge that viruses are, you can say there are viruses cause diseases or they carry diseases. So they're microscopic particles that carry diseases, and how do they carry it is that they are made up of RNA or DNA with a protein covering. So the structure of virus is going to be that they're made up of DNA or RNA, and they have a protein covering on them. Now, since they're made up of deoxyribonucleic acid or the RNA, that is the ribonucleic acid, and they're surrounded by a protective coating of protein, what happens is viruses are partially living organisms, but they cannot reproduce by themselves. So we consider them as non-living. They do perform other life processes, but they do not reproduce. Therefore, we do not consider them as living organisms. So they cannot reproduce by themselves. Now, since viruses cannot reproduce by themselves, how do they spread diseases? Because for diseases to be spread, they need to make copies of themselves. They need to spread out through the entire body. But we've just said that the viruses, they're non-living organisms that do not reproduce by themselves. So what do the viruses then do? The viruses, what they do is they reproduce by taking over other living cells. So the viruses, they go and they attack other living cells. They make new copies of themselves and they kill the host cell. So the viruses, what they do is they go and attack another cell. When they attack another cell, they kill that host cell and they make new copies of themselves through that cell. So when they make other copies of themselves, they make rapid new copies of themselves, then they go and infect other cells in the organism. So for example, there's some cell in a specific organ of your body that is very weak or is not, it does not have all the nutrients present. So the virus will go attack that specific cell that it knows is easy to kill. It will make copies of itself through that cell, and then it will kill that specific cell and go infect other cells in the organism. So a virus does not reproduce by itself, but what it does is it infects other cells and it kills it and makes copies of itself. So it's going to be reproducing through that specific process. Now, when we're talking about the virus, what virus does is when we're talking about the structure of the virus, yes, it is smaller than bacteria. We've already done that. Bacteria comes between the virus and the fungi. So yes, it is smaller than bacteria. Since it's smaller than bacteria and we could not see the bacteria under an electronic microscope, so we cannot even see our virus under an electronic microscope. And the problem with the virus is we cannot even see it under an electronic microscope. We just need a specific kind of microscope, that is the electron microscope, through which we can see or detect or see these cells, the specific functions, the specific characteristics, and the parts of a virus cell. So we can only see it through an electron microscope, which is even more specific or even more smaller than an electronic microscope. So it has a greater magnification than an electronic microscope. So that is going to be all about viruses. So we now know that when we're talking about microorganisms, there are living things that are too small to be seen without the aid of a microscope. However, there are different sizes. So the virus is going to be the smallest of them all, then comes the bacteria, and then comes the fungi. We've done the differences between the bacteria and the fungi, and we know how the cells of the two have, what differences the cells of the two have. And then we've also studied about the other microorganisms, what other types of microorganisms are there. And we've also done what viruses are made up of, what the structure of viruses is, how the viruses reproduce since they're not living organisms. All right, so do you have any questions up till now?
No. Yes, I just had a question. Are viruses like the most smallest microorganism?
Yes, we do consider viruses the smallest of all the organisms because yes, they are smaller than bacteria and they're smaller than fungi.